Thank you very much for inviting me and to discuss this very important topic, which clearly is on everyone's mind at the moment. And maybe I'll try to put it into what I see as the broader European context before coming to what might be the next steps, because I think it's important to be clear about where we see this. And from our perspective, the moment the war of aggression started, the moment the tanks of Russia rolled across the border, it's clear that this is a watershed moment in European history. Things are not the same after this moment as they were before. This will have a profound impact on the way the European Union does policy, and we've already seen that within the short time, within 5 weeks, the response of the European Union was, I would say, quick. It was decisive, and it was united. Not what necessarily would have been expected from the beginning, and it shows that this is seen very differently by Europe's capitals and by Europe's institutions. Because what is here is really a challenge, not only to Ukraine, and I think it's important to emphasize that the Ukrainian population at the moment is taking the brunt of this. It is unimaginable suffering which is happening there, the shelling of civilians. This is something which has to stop. But it also is a challenge to the security architecture of Europe. It is a challenge to Europe's way of life, to our values, to our interests, and to our principles. And that means the response to this is going to be a strong response, and that is exactly what we've seen. What it has also emphasized for Europeans is that the security architecture which is there still matters. NATO continues to matter. The transatlantic relationship continues to matter. And I think the visit of Biden has re-emphasized that for Europe, that is the important hard security aspect, which always is at the forefront. I think we will end up having a new look at all policies across the whole range, not just foreign policy, security policy, but we will have to look at energy policy, we have to look at refugee migration policy, at agricultural policy, at industrial policy, at economic governance, at fiscal policy. It is a very, very wide-ranging impact on policies. But I think in the end, what this has also shown as not an intended effect, but I think what has become very clear is that if Europe acts together, it still has a considerable weight, it has considerable leverage in global affairs. So what does that mean for the foreseeable future? I think from a European perspective, certainly nobody wanted this war. And if there's a possibility to stop it, then that would be very welcome. But clearly this will have to depend on Ukraine. It will be down to Ukraine to agree with Russia what a ceasefire or a peace deal might look like. As long as there is no such ceasefire or peace deal, the European Union is going to continue to support Ukraine, including with the weapons which have been exported to Ukraine in this war. I think what there is in terms of the international expectation, certainly there's no wish of NATO or the European Union to escalate this into a direct conflict with Russia, a direct military conflict with Russia, given the consequences that would have. But that also means that Russia has to refrain from threatening with nuclear weapons, threatening with biological weapons or chemical weapons. This is very important, that these lines are not crossed at any point in this. And I would expect that also the pressure from the international community, including from China, will be very clear that this is not an escalation which could ever be contemplated by anyone. I think the longer term question really is, what impact does this have on EU-China relations? And there it will very much depend from a European perspective on what steps China takes in this war, whether it does end up being neutral, trying to broker some form of peace, or whether it will side with Russia in this. Russia has made it clear that it would like direct military support also from China. If that happens, it's going to be seen very negatively from the European Union, and it will have a very negative impact on EU-China relations also in the long run. So it very much depends, I think, on what kind of messages now come out of Beijing. That will determine how the European Union reacts, and that's why I think the EU-China summit is very important to also see what kind of discussions are there. And just to reiterate, and I'll finish on that, the point I made at the beginning, that this is a watershed moment. So everything which is going to happen from now on is going to be seen through the lens of what does that mean in terms of this geostrategic, geopolitical situation. So the EU-China relationship is also going to be measured within that context.
Okay, great. Thank you, Fabian. And yeah, I think you are right. You are talking about this watershed moment that really is going on. And but over the past weekend, we see President Biden made a very strong speech in Warsaw. Basically, he was talking about Putin cannot remain in power. I mean, that's a very strong message. So we probably don't see that the European get more strategically independent, but more so now tied with the US, and the US is actually pushing for public war confrontation with Russia. So that will be a little risky as well. So what do you think about what are the European proposals, particularly from the think tank, how this can be done, like through the shuttle diplomacy, or maybe talks in Turkey or UN, whatever. So maybe just a follow-up question for Fabian. What do you think? What can we do to de-escalate? That's really the topic of today.
I mean, just to say on Biden, I don't think he's pushing for a wider confrontation. I think it's very clear that the US is not willing to get into a military confrontation with Russia, and neither is the EU. So this, I think, is very important because we want to enter these discussions in the right way. I think there are a number of proposals on the table of what a future could look like. But I think what is very important from a European perspective is that we cannot and we should not have these discussions without involving Ukraine. It is very crucial that in the current situation, given also the immense suffering Ukrainian people have endured, that it is clear that Ukraine has to be the one which actually finds whatever ceasefire proposals, whatever peace proposals are on the table acceptable. And as far as I can see at the moment, there still is a very big gap between what Moscow is demanding and what Ukraine is willing to accept. At the moment, the key question for me is the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Clearly, Kiev has stated that it is not willing to accept the Donbass or ceding Crimea, as long as Russia demands those kind of things. I don't think we will see a ceasefire. So I think what we have to see at the moment is how we manage the situation, how we also enable Ukraine to resist this war. A ceasefire can only come if there's a meeting of minds between Moscow and Kiev, and at the moment that's not there. I think there can be, and there have been discussions around, for example, what could this mean in terms of NATO membership? What could this mean in terms of EU membership? I think these are discussions which Europeans are willing to enter into. I think there's also the question of economic sanctions. If there was an agreement between Ukraine and Russia, I'm sure that economic sanctions would be part of that. I think Europe would be willing to also see a gradual lifting of economic sanctions if that is the case. But having said all that, just to add one more sentence, I think it's also important to recognize that in some ways things have been broken which cannot be fixed, at least not in the short term. So I think what we are going to see, regardless of what the outcome is on the ground, is that there is an economic decoupling between the European Union and China, and that the relationship is going to deteriorate both economically and politically, and that this is not going to be something which will be over anytime soon. Firstly, it is important from a European perspective. I would say that the alliances which are there are seen very differently now than they were 5 weeks ago. So from a European perspective, NATO does work. And certainly when you go to those countries directly in the front line with Russia, there's a clear perception that for those countries, their security is only guaranteed because NATO is in place. So we cannot distract from the fact that the cause of this war has not been expansion of NATO. It has not been that in some way Russia was treated badly by the West. The cause of this war, it's a war of aggression where Russia has chosen to question the whole security architecture of Europe and is directly challenging that architecture. So whatever solution is on the table cannot be something which is aimed at compromising or appeasing Russia. It has to be something which is clearly reflecting who the aggressor was in this case and what that has meant for Ukraine. So it, in the end, comes back to the question of what is acceptable to Ukraine, and whether Ukraine will insist on NATO membership or not. I think this is an area where Zelensky has said there's some room for maneuver, but it will still be the case that Ukraine will look for security guarantees, and it will also look for its territorial integrity. So if we are to have some form of peace conference, I think the, if you like, ground rules have to be very clear. That this cannot be the question of some kind of bargain whereby Russia then keeps the territories it has conquered by force. But it has to be something which aims at a longer term solution, which guarantees the integrity of Ukraine and the security of Ukraine. So I think there is room to have these talks as long as Ukraine is directly involved and is making the choices. But I think it also has to be very clear that there are limits to what can be given away and what is acceptable. And I think in the end, we are talking about something which has disrupted economies. It has had a terrible impact, especially on the Ukrainian population. And that will continue to be the case. So we cannot, in my view, go back to where we were before this conflict. We can try to manage the aftermath of it. We can try to manage the impact. That also means, and I think this is also something where I would look to the international community, is to have consideration of how can we help those who are most vulnerable, who are being affected by this. So what can we do in terms of the reconstruction of Ukraine? What can we do in terms of the negative impact of this conflict on inflation, on energy prices, but also, and I think this is a big role for the international community, is to deal with the food price increases, to deal with the impact this will have on some of the developing nations around the world. And there, I think much more can be done, and it's something which can be done in collaboration. But I'm coming back to what I said in my opening remarks. I think what has to be clear here is that what Russia has chosen to do, or what Vladimir Putin has chosen to do, is not acceptable, cannot be acceptable. And it cannot lead to a situation where Russia gains something from starting a war of aggression, putting the civilian population under shelling, doing all the things which has been happening in the last 5 weeks. That cannot lead to a situation where Russia then gains territory and question the choice of a country to be part of the European Union, to be part of the security architecture. I think we have to be very clear here that we will not find a sustainable solution if we ignore those issues. It has to be very clear about what has happened and what the consequences have to be of that. I'll be very brief given the timing, but just I think what has been said, I just wanted to bring it back to the role of China. And I think it is really important that China does use its power and influence with Moscow as much as possible. One, to emphasize this question of non-use of nuclear weapons, non-use of chemical weapons. I think that has to be very clear. Secondly, I think it's important that there is no direct military support for Russia, because that would inflame the conflict further. And I think there should be real pressure on Putin to cease and desist what is happening in Ukraine, in particular, also the shelling of civilians. And finally, I think there has to be this clear message that the territorial integrity of Ukraine has to be the outcome of this in the end. So I think China can play a big role in helping Moscow to reconsider what it can get out of this war and how we best end it.